Few ties test Europe's strategic nerve as profoundly as its relationship with China, a vast trade partner, a technology competitor, and at times a systemic rival. Beijing sits at the center of Europe's debates about security, resilience, and strategic autonomy. The lack of a unified EU policy towards China, coupled with the impact of US influence, is now a decisive element shaping Europe's place in the world. My guest today is Charles Michel, President Emeritus of the European Council, a man who steered EU leaders through years of unprecedented turbulence, from the pandemic and Brexit to war on Europe's borders. He has been a strong advocate for the continent's unity, for its global voice, and for its capacity to act with both coherence and conviction. Mr. President, welcome to AnewZ Exclusive.
Thank you.
Mr. President, you have publicly asked, where is the EU's China policy? Why do you believe that the European Union has struggled for so long to define a coherent, unified approach towards China?
Look, we live in a multipolar world, and it means that if the European Union has the ambition to have more influence in the future, it's very important to engage with many countries across the world, many regions across the world, and there is no doubt that China is an important international actor and player. And of course, we have our differences with China in terms of history, in terms of political model, that's very clear, but I think we have the responsibility to manage our differences in a responsible way, on the one hand, and on the other hand, we have to identify on both sides, in China and within the EU, what are our priorities. And our relationships between the EU and China should be based on its own merits, without being influenced by other actors. I think that Washington or Moscow, they don't need to influence the future relationship between China and the EU. The Europeans and the Chinese, they have the responsibility to decide what we want to do together in the future.
It's quite often said that the European Union defines China as a partner, competitor, and systemic rival. Do you think this triple characterization still serves EU's interests effectively, or do you see in this triple characterization some element of confusion as well?
Look, on my side, I've always avoided to use with my mouth this sentence, because I think that our relationship should be larger and should be more ambitious in the future. And that's why I think that there are three priorities. The first one, that's how is it possible for the EU, because of our values, our principles, to defend human rights, democratic principles, and to try to develop more mutual understanding in that field, point one. Point two, we have in Europe a serious challenge related to our supply chains. And we have to diversify our supply chains to be less dependent in the future. And it's possible to discuss with the Chinese authorities what are our priorities in this field. But for that, the European Union has to be clear on our concrete priorities. That's too vague if we just say that we want more reciprocity. Of course, we all want more reciprocity, but we should be more precise in terms of substance, in terms of content. What does it mean? On the other hand, the Chinese authorities, the Chinese people, they have their own challenges. And the access to the single market is very important for China, especially in this current geopolitical context. And it's why we should be more transactional and more realistic in the way we engage with China. It doesn't mean that we would give up in terms of what we are on the EU side, but we can engage in a responsible way, in a respectful way, and we can try to defend our principles, to defend our interests at the same time. And there is another important element. There is no doubt that China and the EU, we have, for many reasons, a special responsibility in terms of tackling global challenges, development aid and support for the developing countries, for instance, climate change, biodiversity. In all those fields, we have a lot that we should discuss, and we should cooperate much more in the future together to address those global challenges for all of us as one humanity.
Thank you, Mr. Michel. You already responded to this question, but I would like you to elaborate on that particular point. In your writings and in your articulations, you have consistently stressed the need for more precision in Europe's economic demands towards China, such as rebalancing trade and diversifying supply chains. But what would a more strategically disciplined economic approach look like, and how should the EU communicate this particular moment to Beijing?
Look, I think that unfortunately, the last summit between China and the EU has been a missed opportunity. I regret. I'm a bit sad, in fact, and I have the impression that maybe on both sides we were too much influenced by some external global realities. But having said that, in the future, I'm absolutely convinced that the European Union should identify more precisely what are the critical and strategic sectors where it's important to reduce our dependencies on China, but not only on China. And I think that's very important also at the same time to identify with China how we can deepen our cooperation in the field of multilateralism, in the field of more stability, more security across the world. China is a permanent member of the Security Council, and it gives this country a special responsibility for that reason, in terms of global security, global stability, in terms of defending the UN Charter, the territorial integrity, the territorial sovereignties. And here, you understand, I'm referring to the war launched by Russia against Ukraine. That's the first very important topic and challenge for the future. On the other hand, you're absolutely right that in the economic fields, in the trade fields, we have to discuss, we have to engage. And you know, we have learned our lessons within the EU. You know, we were extremely dependent on Russian fossil fuels. It was a weakness. And now we understand that in the future, that's better to diversify our relationships, to diversify our supply chains. And I'm absolutely convinced it should be possible to have this realistic and respectful dialogue between the EU and the Chinese authorities. The Chinese authorities, they have a need for this access to the European single market, which is a very important added value for the Chinese economy. If they would like to have this access, I think that's fair, that on the EU side, we are very precise in terms of rebalancing some strategic interest and some strategic access to some critical raw materials, for instance.
Mr. President, you also warned that Europe should not allow its China policy to be shaped by other international players. And I think that was a clear reference to Washington, to United States influence. Where do you draw the...
And to Russia, and to Russia, yes. And to Russia and to Moscow.
So where do you draw the line between transatlantic alliance and alignment and strategic autonomy, especially under current global tensions? Because maintaining good relations with the United States is absolutely key in the context of European interests. But to what extent do you think Europe should take actions in order to make sure that vitality of that relationship does not militate against EU's strategic autonomy?
Look, we have a lot in common with the United States, there is no doubt, and also because of our common history and because of some common principles and values that we defend across the world. But having said that, there is a reality. The United States today, and that's not new, that's not only because of the election of Mr. Donald Trump. I think it's something more substantial and more long-term for the United States. The evolution in the United States is very simple and very clear. Now, today, America First is put into practice, and there are consequences for the rest of the world. We have seen the trade war launched by the United States against the rest of the world, including against the European Union, and at least the traditional closest allies of the United States, point one. We've also seen the difficulties we have on the EU side to engage with the United States in terms of defending and supporting Ukraine, which is attacked by Russia and by the Kremlin. And one thing is very clear in my opinion, and it's not new, but this conviction is strengthened by the latest developments. I think that the European Union has the responsibility to become more and more autonomous, to defend our interests, to promote our values, to have more influence across the world. And the more we can cooperate with our partners and friends, including with the traditional allies and partners like the United States, the better it would be. But we should be ready to face any eventuality. And that's why I think that we need to develop our own capabilities in the field of security and defense. We need to build a true European defense industry to be less dependent in the security field, point one. And we have to develop our competitiveness and to improve our competitiveness and to improve our regulation. Because the last years, probably, we have exaggerated a bit, taking too much into account this precautionary principle, which became and which is becoming more and more a principle of suspicion against the entrepreneurship, against the spirit of innovation, when some other competitors across the world, the United States or China, are investing a lot in the field of innovation, including through investments in artificial intelligence, in new technologies. We have also, on our side, on the EU, to be a fair and active player and actor in those fields.
Mr. President, our conversation is taking place in the wake of the latest talks related to the fate of Ukraine, both in Alaska and just in Washington. What is your feeling about the debate surrounding Ukraine? As a person who led European foreign policy for years, are you concerned about the fate of this country now that debate, some of its fundamental exigencies, seem to have somewhat changed in 2025?
Look, I think what is going on and what will be the result of those conversations in the days or in the weeks to come will be important not only for Ukraine, it will be important for the world, because it will shape what kind of multilateral cooperation we want in the future. And you remember that following World War II, we, global leaders, or our predecessors, the global leaders, they made fundamental decisions by launching the United Nations, by agreeing on the UN Charter. And these are very simple and effective principles that we should all follow, accept, and respect. The territorial integrity, the territorial sovereignty, respect for human dignity. And what is absolutely terrible in those circumstances, that's the fact that a country, Russia, the Kremlin, made the decision to invade its neighbor. And this country, Russia, because this country has in its possession the nuclear weapon, has the impression that there is a kind of immunity and that everything is possible. And that's a very dangerous precedent for the rest of the world. And it's not a surprise if I'm telling you. That's why we on the EU side, we would like all the countries across the world, including China, including countries in the Caucasus, we would like those countries to be very clear, to defend the UN Charter, because today that's with Ukraine. If we accept it, if we tolerate it, if at the end there is a victory in terms of territories, in terms of political victory for the aggressor, that's a terrible message sent to the rest of the world, and it will put at risk our common future.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me turn to the South Caucasus, with your permission, a region that you engaged with directly during your time as President of the European Council. As you know, on the 8th of August, a very historic joint declaration between Azerbaijan and Armenia was signed in Washington, marking a major breakthrough with sort of a new reality being formed. It's not a peace treaty yet, but the provisions have been initial, which is very important, of course. And also, Azerbaijan and Armenia seems to have agreed on a connectivity. There's going to be a Trump route for international peace and prosperity. What is your assessment of this development, and how do you see the implications for the broader regional dynamics?
You know that I have worked a lot together with President Aliyev and with Prime Minister Pashinyan and their teams to facilitate more mutual understanding. And you remember that through what was called at that time the Brussels format or the Brussels platform, I've tried to offer an honest political platform to allow and to facilitate those exchanges between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And all the topics I've put on the table, because I've tried at that time to listen carefully and actively to both countries, to both interlocutors, and all the topics and all the priorities and also the proposals that I formulated at that time are today a strong foundation and a strong basis. And it's good that a few days ago this statement was expressed in the United States. I have the impression that we did our part to help and to facilitate. Now, what will be important, in my opinion, that's the agreement on a peace treaty, so that every topic is solved for the future, which would allow more stability, more predictability, more trust in that region. And I'm absolutely convinced that that region plays and can play in the future a more important role in terms of being a bridge between various parts of the world. And that's why connectivity is a fundamental challenge, and that's why I've tried with my team at that time to propose some innovative ideas and solutions to help both countries to come closer to each other.
And in fact, yes, of course, we remember the first Brussels meeting in late December 2021 when you met President Aliyev, Prime Minister Pashinyan. We remember the second one in early April. There was a moment at the inception of a bilateral format when the foreign ministers exchanged phone calls. We remember the third meeting, of course, late, and then fourth meeting in August 2022. And also we, of course, remember October 2022 when in Prague, Azerbaijan and Armenia recognized each other's territorial integrity. You were very crucial to that agreement, and that was a key milestone within the Armenian peace process. When you look at the architecture of peace, which is currently being forged by Armenia and Azerbaijan, is this exactly what you were trying to achieve yourself? And as President Emeritus of the European Council, do you feel slightly sorry that that declaration was signed in Washington, not in Brussels? Because it could have been signed in Brussels had the circumstances proven to be auspicious, or you think it's just a peripheral matter? What matters? That
no, look. No. I'm very realistic, and I know very well the rules of the game, and I have no doubt. And it was also clearly said by both countries that the role played by this Brussels format was and has been extremely important and crucial. Because one thing is absolutely clear: Brussels and the EU, we do not have any hidden agenda. We want more stability, we want peace and predictability in that region, because that's our own interest to have this stability in our direct neighborhood, and also to develop more ties with all the countries in that region. That's why this declaration took place in Washington. Yes, indeed, another option could have been this declaration in Brussels, but that's not the most important. The most important, that's this path towards more stability, more serenity in that region. And we know that the history of South Caucasus is a difficult and a painful one. And that's why it requires a lot of political courage and political vision to be ready to look at the future and to identify how in the future we can work more together, we can cooperate more together, including trying to build more trust and more confidence. And that's very important for the that's in my opinion the most important thing.
And Mr. President, my last question to you, with your permission. We know that external actors, Iran, Russia, some of them not particularly happy with the reality created in South Caucasus. You know about Azerbaijan's relation with Russia, which leave a lot to be desired at this particular juncture. Do you think Azerbaijan and Armenia in the South Caucasus are resilient enough to be able to defend what they have attained together bilaterally, or do you see any systemic risk that may emanate from up north?
No, that's a very good question, and I'm confident that both leadership in Armenia and Azerbaijan, they will do everything not to be trapped in some games played by some of their neighbors. Let's be clear. At the beginning, when I started to get involved in this mediation between Armenia and Azerbaijan, I was absolutely aware that Russia and the Kremlin was doing everything to make more difficult this rapprochement between Armenia and Azerbaijan, because the interest of the Kremlin and Russia was to maintain those conflicts in the region, and with the expectation or with the hope that because of that, Russia could maintain a certain influence in that region, point one. Point two, you mentioned Iran, and you are absolutely right, because we are lucid about Iran, and we can see how Iran is doing everything to destabilize the neighborhood, to destabilize the region. And we know, for instance, that Azerbaijan is a secular state, which is very important in that region. There's a clear choice made by the authorities in Azerbaijan, and we know how Iran is trying to export hatred, conflicts, extremism, radicalism outside of Iran, and that's not a surprise that Iran is also trying to get and to develop the nuclear weapon, to have this immunity and to have the impression that they would be allowed to do everything in the future to export more conflicts, more hatred. And that's why the more those agreements between Armenia and Azerbaijan will be put in practice, the more there will be cooperation, including with countries in Central Asia, and the more there will be economic partnerships, and the more there will be prosperity, and the more there will be stability and security, the better it will be for all those who believe in peace, stability, predictability, and multilateralism. And that's why I repeat again that there's a big difference between the EU and Russia in South Caucasus. The EU, we do not have any hidden agenda. We are very clear. Maybe we are sometimes too clear, too transparent, and it could sometimes irritate a bit. If that's the case, we apologize for that. But it's very clear that on the Russian side, there is always this imperialist behavior, this nostalgia of the past, and this attempt to consider the former Soviet republics as being part of this influence area of Russia and of the Kremlin. That's, I think, a serious challenge for the countries in that region, and I think that's why the EU is an interesting partner for those countries, because we do not have any hidden agenda, because on the EU side, we sincerely want those countries to succeed in terms of economic reforms, in terms of prosperity, and in terms of being able to guarantee more stability in the future.
Mr. President, I'm very grateful to you for your time. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Pleasure's mine. Well, that was Charles Michel, President Emeritus of the European Council, and with whom we discussed a number of issues related to EU-China relations, Azerbaijan-Armenian peace process, and many other related matters. You've been watching AnewZ Exclusive, and see you very soon.